couple times now I've tried to upload a video on the history of circumcision, and it's actually proven to be rather difficult because that history um, disentangles many different threads. So we have circumcision that has been influenced by cultural reasons, by religious reasons, by medical reasons. And in the course of whenever you have a debate about this, it's very frustrating, like several other topics where you can be pursuing one line of reasoning, one line of logic, only to have the debate suddenly shift into a completely different area. So you could be talking about the pros and cons of the medical benefits or disutilities of circumcision, only to have somebody retort that it's religiously sanctioned or religiously significant. Uh, or likewise, you could be having a debate about the applicability of a religious mandate, only to have somebody buttress their arguments by making medical claims. Um, and while to get a proper view of the entire topic, it is necessary to look into all of those fields. It makes it very difficult to get a coherent picture of what's going on. So around the world, circumcision is actually, not that rare. It's about a third of the world men are circumcised. Uh, Not only within the United States, but among Jews, obviously, especially in Israel. There's some evidence that some Jews in, say, Latin America, it's less common. And then, of course, Muslims, which is a huge group of people, encompassing over 1 billion individuals, 1.5 billion, last that I heard. It's not universally practiced among Muslims, but it's very, very, very common. And then you have places in Melanesia, Micronesia, the Philippines, which, as far as we know, has an independent development of circumcision from that which is practiced by the Semitic peoples or by the Europeans. And then, of course, there's interplay between all this. And sometimes this circumcision is based on very strict religious observance, as is the case with Jews. In fact, this is probably the clearest case that's well known. In Genesis, God demands Abraham to circumcise himself and his son, and this is a covenant. Among Muslims, the religious nature of the practice is uh, far more debatable. Um, it probably was influenced by Jewish circumcision. Uh, Muhammad was allegedly born circumcised, but there is no mandate in the Quran that men be circumcised, or women be circumcised for that matter. Its praises are sung in the Hadith, but it's not necessarily a mandate, and there are certain aspects of Muslim culture, like the idea that you shouldn't shave, you should look like God created you. That would kind of lend itself that maybe you shouldn't circumcise someone. Uh, it becomes quite complicated, though, when you talk about this is something that's done culturally, people do it, and if you are a religious Muslim, you are likely to think, well, my society does this, I'm a religious Muslim, therefore circumcision must be religious. And unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, um, the line between culture and religion is not a strict one. There might be a strict line between theology or literal texts and culture, but religion as it exists and as it's lived and practiced by everyone who practices religion is very much mixed with culture, and it becomes very difficult then to dismiss someone who says, I'm getting circumcised for religious reasons because I'm a Muslim, by going and saying, well, there isn't actually any mandate in Islam that you be circumcised, and this is something you're doing culturally and simply assuming is religious. And we have a similar phenomenon in the United States. Um, a lot of Americans are religious, even evangelical Christians, and the large majority of Americans are circumcised and practice circumcision. And so many of them believe, well, the reason I'm getting circumcised is because of Genesis, because it's in the Bible, and the Bible commands people to get circumcised. And I've read reports of people who were circumcised for this reason. And when you get into debates, this will often be something that comes up. Now, in the case of the United States, we actually know, though, that it's not religious, that it's, at this point, culture, and it was culture that was inspired by medical justifications. So I'm going to be drawing here on a very interesting book that I read last summer, The Surgical Temptation by Robert Darby. I actually found this to be a really fascinating book that actually enhanced the degree that I find circumcision interesting. So medicalized circumcision does have has been influenced by religion, and it's important to remember that. But at the end of the day, circumcision was not popularized in the English-speaking world, whether we're talking about England, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, or Australia, by a religious revolution. There was not a series of religious thinkers who, re-examining the Old Testament or the New Testament, came to the conclusion that circumcision was mandated for Christians. In fact, to the extent that theologians have said anything in the Christian, and this goes to the Catholic, to the Orthodox, to the Protestant, to the extent that they have said anything, it's that circumcision is at best unnecessary and at worst actually wrong. This was debated by the apostles, by Paul, Peter, and the others in the first century in the New Testament, with basically the conclusion being reached that circumcision was an old rite for the old order for the Jews, and that because of Jesus' sacrifice on the cross for our sins, this is very much like kosher and Sabbath keeping and a whole list of other activities that were prohibited, but they were in a new era and it was no longer necessary. And not only that, that if you got circumcised with the hope that this would somehow buy your way into heaven or get you in the good graces of Christ or anything like that, that you were completely wrong. That you could only get into heaven by coming to Christ and having Christ be your personal Savior, and cutting off your foreskin or not was completely irrelevant as far as I was concerned. In fact, if you were doing it with that idea, you had completely the wrong idea. And this became basically the norm in Europe and the rest of Christendom, even to this day, at least theologically speaking, all through the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, and even the Reformation. Jews were kind of distinct for being circumcised, and it was considered to be a barbaric, ancient, outmoded practice, and that the fact that Christians retained their foreskins was just one sign, not certainly the only one or necessarily the most important one, of their having risen above Judaic barbarism, as they would have seen it. So the popularization of circumcision was not because there was a reformation of theological thought that said, oh, the last 1800 years of Christian ideas have been wrong, and the covenant commanded in Genesis on Abraham and his son applies to all of us. That's not what happened. What happened is it was popularized by medical practitioners, by doctors and surgeons. And there was a religious element to that. It's certainly that these doctors and physicians overwhelmingly would have been Christian and overwhelmingly would have been influenced by that to some degree. So an interesting kind of metric to judge how circumcision has been seen in the West is if you look at its entries in the Encyclopedia Britannica in every decade, 1800, 1810, 1820, 1830, 1840, it's referred to as a religious rite among Jews and among Muslims, or Mohammedans, as they would say. And that's what it says in 1860, and in 1870, it says it's a medical practice, a medical procedure, and it's also a religious rite. So that decade from 1860 to 1870 was the decade when medicalized circumcision started to become popularized. Now, there were authors, there were doctors, there were physicians, maybe doctor is the wrong word if we're going this far back, physicians going back as much as a century earlier than that, who discussed circumcision as a medical procedure. There was a famous book by a French physician called, had a long title, but it basically referenced onanism, and the idea was that masturbation is bad, ejaculation of sperm outside of the confines of marriage, or even outside the confines of impregnating your wife, is bad, and that circumcision was something that could potentially protect against this, that it could reduce the sexual impulse and make people more chaste. There are also a host of other claims that it would protect from various diseases. Initially, specifically syphilis was cited based on extremely dubious, not even evidence, but anecdotal observations. There was a doctor who said in his hospital, of all the syphilis patients, only a couple were Jewish, and it was like, well, it was the number that he mentioned were almost exactly their proportion of the population. But since they had a smaller proportion of the population, the logic here was quite bad. But this was convincing evidence for a lot of people. There was also a lot of fear of a disease that we no longer consider a disease called spermatorea. So spermatorea, if you've never heard of it, was quite the rage in the mid 1800s. It had a vague definition because it wasn't describing a real disease, but there was this sense that uh, any sort of ejaculation or loss of fluid through the penis that was done outside the confines of marriage, and according to some doctors, done outside the confines of impregnating and causing, actual reproduction, was a disease, and potentially a very serious disease. Now, they were, again, not describing a real disease, and so um, descriptions varied from any kind of seminal loss, nocturnal emission. Um, some of the things that they described probably were venereal diseases, whether it would be gonorrhea or syphilis, or chlamydia. It's not always clear exactly what they were talking about because they were describing a host of issues. Some of them disagreed on whether nocturnal emissions counted or not. There are those who said a nocturnal emission was definitely spermatorea and a sign of a serious problem, where others didn't think so. And circumcision was touted as a cure for spermatorea, uh, a way to prevent it. Spermatorea was thought to make people effeminate, to make them weak, to lower their their manliness, um, and this is when circumcision became popularized. And I think this is a really important point. The scientific revolution began, in the 1600s and the 1700s. And this is obviously many years later. But this is before the scientific revolution had really reached medicine. Um, the germ theory of medicine, the understanding that diseases can be caused, if not always are caused, by um, biological organisms, bacteria, and viruses that spread through the body through various medium and cause ailments. This was not known. Um, the first kind of research at all was in the 1860s. It wasn't really until the 1890s and really until the first decade of the 20th century that this became understood and accepted. Okay, so Pasteur and Koch, some of the other research, most of the initial research was done in France and in Germany. It wasn't well known in the English-speaking world. It was not initially uh, greeted as truth, as it was a new idea, right? So I've had people tell me, well, Pasteur published his first book in 1865. That didn't mean that everyone in England had read it or had believed in it. In fact, the book recounts a kind of common joke that many British doctors used up until around World War One. They didn't believe in germs, right? The idea was, look, these are microscopic little animals that get into your body. That's just ridiculous. They would tell jokes to their patients when they were coming or going from the office to make sure they close the door, otherwise, quote unquote, the germs will get in. So, and I don't want to poke too much fun. They just didn't know. The technology wasn't at the level where they could make this a certainty. It was unknown. So circumcision became popularized before this revolution in medical science. And, going back and looking at circumcision as a cure for syphilis or gonorrhea or spermatorea or masturbation, the arguments don't make a lot of sense today. They seem quite comical. And I do want to kind of throw out a boon to the physicians of the 19th century. They didn't know. They really didn't know. Microscopes had been invented, but they weren't that powerful. They hadn't been that studied. And you are in this situation where people are dying of diseases all the time, dying horrible deaths. They're suffering. And there was very, very, very little the medical science could do. In the 1700s, they discovered that they could vaccinate against smallpox. This was a huge breakthrough, but they didn't understand how it worked. And this wasn't a treatment. This was a preventative measure. Later, in the 1820s and 30s, they understood antiseptics. They learned that if they did surgery with clean instruments, with boiling water and not reusing knives and stuff, that there was a much lower chance of infection when they did surgery. Prior to this, going to surgery was not necessarily a death sentence, but one of the riskiest things you could do, even a minor surgery. Now they didn't understand microbes, they didn't know why, they just knew that if you made stuff clean, it was safer. And this led to kind of a flourishing of surgery. In the context of another book on the history of cancer called The Emperor of All Maladies, um, that book talks a lot about how surgeons, they didn't understand cancer at all. We still don't understand cancer perfectly. But they knew that they could cut away a tumor, and they would kind of vie with each other about how invasively they could cut, how much tissue could they remove and not kill the patient, how many tendons and ligaments and muscles and cartilage and bone could they effectively cut away while not killing their patient. While there's a certain skill in that, we now recognize that they didn't really know what they were doing, and they had lost actually a lot of commonsensical wisdom. They did know that, like, a lot of times you would remove a tumor and it would just metastasize anyway. The person would die, and in the intervening years or months, they would just be missing whatever body parts you hacked away. So the Greek physician Galen had said that even though it was possible to remove tumors, say from a breast, it usually was not advisable to do so because the victim would eventually die anyway. The surgery, if anything, would risk killing them immediately, and if it did not, they would simply live the rest of their lives in a more decrepit state than they otherwise would, and that it was better to simply leave them alone. And there was an ambition among doctors, and not one that we can't understand, to achieve fame, to conquer these problems, and this was the only tool they had, was surgery. So there was a tendency to look for surgical solutions because they didn't have antibiotic solutions. They didn't have pharmacological solutions to any of these problems. And you can almost understand, you're a doctor, it's 1850, you're in England, and of course you're seeing sick people all the time. People are coming in, and children, adults, and they have all kinds of problems. The adults are going to have all kinds of venereal diseases, whether it's chlamydia or gonorrhea or syphilis. The children are going to have tuberculosis and measles and mumps, the flu, who knows, all kinds of stuff. And they have no ability to treat any of it, and they have no idea what's actually causing it. And you can definitely understand how someone could then, while they're interviewing these people, say, well, do you eat a lot of watermelon? Do you have you gone fishing lately? Or you have you discharge sperm? Do you masturbate? Do you play with yourself? Do you engage in onanism? And you can imagine that basically everybody does. And so it would be very simple to say, look, everybody that I see, every man who comes into my office who's sick, they masturbate. Oh, maybe masturbation is the cause. It's not logically correct in the strict sense of logic. There's a correlation causation fallacy there, but you could see how it could make intuitive sense to someone. Now, where this gets religious is that even though Christianity had rejected the idea of circumcision or mandating circumcision or buying your way into heaven with circumcision, and it even ridiculed it as a Jewish barbarism, there was the sense that sex was bad or sexual pleasure was bad, that sex should be restricted, and that it should be harnessed in a relatively specific scenario, namely with your wife, and potentially even only while you procreate with your wife. Now, this influence led some people and some doctors to say, well, maybe we should help along with that, and we should do things that will help reduce sexual pleasure and therefore make people more chaste. And this wasn't just to men. Female circumcision became popularized as part of this. There was an understanding that removing the foreskin of a man would reduce his sexual pleasure. This is something that will now be contested and denied ad nauseum today by the proponents of circumcision, but it was widely, if not universally, admitted by the people who popularized it in the first place, that it would reduce sexual pleasure. And then this was good because then you could not be so tempted by the evils of masturbation and self-love and onanism. This was definitely an influence, but not a theological mandate. So you see that these medicalized reasons became popular. By the time, and there have been other theories of what caused illness, not just demonic possession necessarily, but there was the idea of galvanism, that it was created by electricity moving through the nerves. There was the nerve theory of medicine, which was that stimulation in one part of the body could cause an ailment in another part of the body. So the logic, this wasn't only applied to masturbation, but the idea was if you're playing with your penis a lot, that is going to create nerve damage that could give you syphilis later, or could give you nervous breakdowns, or make you go insane. This is where we hear that a lot, and it's like, how could they believe that? Well, if you believe in the nerve theory of pathology, which is what a lot of people did, sure, why not? Then later in the 19th century, after they discovered antiseptics, they also started to discover that if they clean up the city, if they put in better sewers and drains, if they got rid of the spittoons and the outhouses and made things cleaner, disease rates in cities went down. So there was all this urban utility planning that reduced the spread of typhus or typhoid fever or cholera. And people didn't know, again, about microbes. They weren't sure why, but there was this, cleaner equals healthier. And this fed also into the, not only, it's less pleasurable, so it's not going to tempt you into, cheating on your wife or being obsessed with sex, but cleaner equals less disease. So if we can remove tissue, that tissue can no longer be dirty. The foreskin will no longer be a trap for particulates, for matter that is, quote, dirty. This is when smegma got particularly demonized. No one really talked about smegma before. This is a bad thing or a terrible thing, but now it became that, and it's kind of retained that odium ever since. And now we know that none of that is true, but that was the milieu in which it became popularized. Now, after the advent of the acceptance of the germ theory of medicine, by that point it was already widely practiced, widely done, and a new set of justifications or rationalizations were brought up that it protected against other diseases, that it protected against cancer, for instance, was a popular one for a long time, although no longer. And now people will say HIV. This is, I think, the most clear rationalization. I could do a whole video on the studies on the HIV, but because they are very problematic studies in their conclusions and how they were run, but that's not my main point here. My main point here is nobody alive today was circumcised because of those studies. People are circumcised for cultural reasons, and those studies are cited to rationalize the fact that it was done. The practice was popularized way before there was HIV, way before those studies were committed, HIV didn't exist probably until the 30s or 40s. It wasn't getting studied until really the 80s, and by then circumcision rates were in the United States, over 80, over 90%. So at this point, that is a rationalization, not a justification. So in the United States, and this is also true in Britain. Here's another interesting facet of this. It was very difficult for doctors to convince adults to get circumcised. Going to an adult man who presumably masturbates and presumably has sex and presumably enjoys sex, it's difficult to convince him to cut off part of his penis, any part. Whatever, we can debate the relative importance of foreskin, say, to the glands or to other aspects of the penis, but any part at all is going to be wrapped up in the identity of that man and his sexual biography. So that proved very difficult. Doctors tried. There are very few people willing to take them on. However, convincing parents to have it done to their sons, to their children, that was an easier sell, because the child could not say no, could not, especially if they're a young child or a newborn. So in England, it was typically done to younger boys, not infants necessarily. I think there was an understanding that You shouldn't do it to very new babies because there's a higher risk of death and injury. And also, it was simply used as if problems develop. Now, their definition of problems was pretty wide. If you couldn't retract the foreskin, that was considered phimosis, and so that was grounds to circumcise. Even though we know now, and we knew then, actually before then, that in most people the foreskin is fused to the glands of the penis until later in adolescence, and some people until they're 17 or 18, but in most people until after they're 11, 10, something like that. So they're going to 5, 6, 7-year-old kids and saying, "Oh, you can't retract your foreskin. Obviously, you have phimosis, and you need to be circumcised." Or if the children played with themselves, if they masturbated, kind of famously or infamously, John Maynard Keynes and his brother were both circumcised in this fashion. We actually know quite a bit about it because his brother talked about it later in life. But they were young children, 10-ish, 5 to 10-ish. We don't know the exact year. And apparently John Maynard Keynes would play with himself too often. At one point, his father actually sewed his pockets closed because he would put his hands in his pockets and presumably, according to the father, we don't know if this is true or not, would play with himself through his pockets. And to finally put an end to it, he was forced to undergo a circumcision, usually done without anesthetic. They would kind of do that without anesthetic with the purpose of making the person associate their penis with pain. So instead of looking at the penis as something to be pleasurable or to have fun with, it was something that you should view as torturous. And there's evidence that John Maynard Keynes kind of resented this for the rest of his life, and there is sort of a non-explicit but highly suggestive literature among a lot of poets, historians, and others in England, where they kind of lament the loss of something important to them early in their life. I don't have the quotes here, but some of it is very hard to not see the linkage with that happening to the fact that they were circumcised when they were old enough to remember it, and kind of an idealizing of non-circumcised people or adults. So there's a common trope in English homosexual literature of looking at, say, Norwegian sailors or Italian migrant workers as kind of like the idealized form of manhood. And there's some evidence, but it is, I will admit, quite speculative, that part of that might have been kind of a longing or I don't want to say a PTSD, but a coping mechanism for the trauma of being circumcised as a small child as opposed to an infant. In the United States, it kind of became popular among infants and is usually done even to this day within the first week of life, not in the first 10 years, and not as if you have problems, right? So in England, it was, well, if you have these problems, but if you didn't have them, you might get through. And we think that the highest rate of circumcision in the United Kingdom was around 30 to 40%, maybe 35%. We don't have great records on this, but and that would have been in, say, 1920, 1930, and then the rates declined slightly, and then at the end of the 1940s, there was a famous report by pediatrician Gardner, who basically said that the medical benefits are vanishingly small and vague, and yet we have a certain number of children every year who die from the operation. A small number, but a number nonetheless, and that the medical benefits don't justify those deaths, and it became very rare in the United Kingdom after that. Those same arguments eventually took hold in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, more dramatically and quickly in Australia and New Zealand than in Canada, but they did not in the United States. And one of the differences, and there are several, is that in the United States, as being a richer society than the UK, more people were able to afford an operation than in the UK. In the UK, prior to the NHS, only really wealthy or well-to-do upper middle class people would have been in a position to pay for circumcision. In the United States, even though we certainly didn't have a universal healthcare system, more people were able to afford it. It might be true that it was the upper classes initially who were getting circumcised, but middle class and lower class people then aspired to that, and they had the financial means to do so. So it's conceivable that a farmer in 1890s in rural England, even if he wanted to have his son circumcised, may not have had the shillings to make it happen. Whereas his American equivalent in 1890 could have afforded it and very likely did, or not in 1890 so much, but so circumcision was eventually became vastly more common in the United States. So it reached over 50% by 1920, and by World War II in the 1950s, we're talking over 80 or 90% of the newborns. And that's the other element. It was done proactively to everybody. It was done to newborns. There are probably some differences in the culture and the zeitgeist of the United States and the UK that explain this, but I'm not entirely sure what they are. But there is clearly, maybe this is a puritanical element, maybe this is a normalizing, oh, we have all these immigrants, well, we want to all be the same in this regard. I don't know. There's also a very interesting and completely understudied correlation with communal showering and public bathing here, where, oh, well, everyone's going to see. Well, you don't want everyone to see that you're a dirty, uncircumcised Irishman or Italian. You want everyone to see that you're progressive and educated and wealthy enough that you can afford such a beneficial procedure. That's an element. I don't know how much of one, but it certainly is one. So while circumcision, medicalized circumcision, fell away in the UK, where it continued only as a religious practice primarily, or as an elective procedure done to people who might medically need it or choose to have it done. And there are certainly some people in the UK, even today, who decide to have it done for aesthetic reasons, which is ethically completely different than doing it to non-consenting children. The rates continued to rise in the United States until the 1980s and the 1990s when they started to drop. And we actually don't have an explanation as to why they've started to drop. What the book points out is that even at the height of circumcision in the UK, still 2/3 of the population was intact, and 2/3 of the doctors were probably also intact. And so while you did have some people who were doing their level best to demonize foreskin, and some of this was obviously sincere belief for either religious or medical reasons, and some of this was also incentivized by the idea not only of making money but of achieving status, right? If you can be the surgeon who says, look, I have the answer, I have the solution to all of these problems, and that solution is circumcision, people want to believe that they have the solution, right? So there's a unification of motivations here, but you always had enough people who were still uncircumcised who would say, yeah, that's bullshit, I don't believe that. The foreskin isn't worthless, I find my foreskin valuable. I don't buy your argument that it's unvaluable. I don't have a dirty penis, I've never had a problem, and so I don't buy into your bullshit. But if you have a situation where the vast majority of people are circumcised, well, you don't have any people with that perspective. And I know for me, I had read a couple times on the internet some of the controversy, and I just didn't buy it. I thought, well, I feel fine, and everyone I know is circumcised. Everyone I've ever known has been circumcised. Obviously, these intactivists don't know what they're talking about. And what really kind of started to crack the shell of conservative bias there was talking to people in non-circumcising cultures, specifically the UK and Iceland, where I talked to friends of mine, straight and gay both, initially all straight guys, and they told me things along other interesting revelations that they certainly didn't struggle with constant illness and disease, which is what I had been taught. The way that it's demonized, the way that the pro-circumcision people will speak about foreskin, you'd get the impression that it was literally the most disease-ridden part of the body, that it does nothing but breed problems. Now, there's a kernel of truth in the sense that foreskin's not magic, and you can have problems associated with your foreskin just like you can have problems associated with every part of your body. But the idea that you would constantly be hampered by uncontrollable infections was completely erroneous. When I talk to my friends, and I asked them questions about how often do you get infected, how often do you get sick, they were perplexed. They had no idea what I was talking about. And for me personally, that was kind of like the first kind of crack in my bias. But if you live in a society where there are almost no or practically no uncircumcised men, that conversation is unlikely to happen. And even among the minority that are uncircumcised, there's a tendency for them to then feel shamed, to feel alienated, to not want to be singled out. They don't want to be made fun of. And so, yes, there are actually millions of uncircumcised men in the United States. There's probably more uncircumcised men in the United States than there are in the UK. But they are basically silent. It's very hard to get them to say anything. In all my time looking into this and scouring YouTube and scouring the internet, it's actually rare, very rare, to find any pro-foreskin intact men in the United States. Most of the intactivists out there are not Americans. They're Canadians, or they're New Zealanders, or they're British, or they're Australian. It's quite interesting, actually. And that element, I think, has been really key. The fact that so many people are circumcised as babies obliterates the alternative view from their firsthand experience. If you were circumcised and everyone know you were circumcised before you have any memory of anything before, right? So if you did this to a 10-year-old, they might retain enough to resent it, to associate it with pain. Some of them may still agree with the circumcision, some of them not. It's going to be mixed. When you do it to their baby, you obliterate any alternative perspective from their mind, basically forever, at least in terms of firsthand knowledge. So that's the situation we have in the United States. It was not a religious movement. Now, there are many religious Americans, and they read the Bible, and they think, well, I'm circumcised, and it says this in Genesis, so maybe that's why. And again, that's an intuitive logic that you can understand, but it's not correct. And when I've seen some interesting videos of people calling in to like Bible answer people, like experts in the Bible, and asking them this, and you can tell the asker is looking for validation. I remember the one I'm thinking about here, a mother who had had her children circumcised was calling and basically saying, she had heard that it's bad, but isn't it in the Bible? And the Bible expert, so-called, I don't know what his bona fides actually were, but said, no, circumcision is not mandated by the Bible. You should not do circumcision for theological, Christian, religious reasons. He demurred a little bit by saying, if you do it for other reasons, if you're doing it for medical reasons, well, that is theologically neutral, right? So it's not wrong necessarily to circumcise if you're doing it for the right reasons, being non-religious. But you can see she was a little dissatisfied because I think she'd been hoping that he was going to say, yes, God says to get circumcised, and if you're not, you're going to hell. So, yes, this book here, The Surgical Temptation, is a good history of the secular adoption of medical circumcision, and it's a great pairing with Leonard Glick's book, Marked in Your Flesh, Circumcision in Ancient Judea and Modern America, which more covers it from the religious history point of view. Both of them are excellent books. I was surprised about many of the facts and parts of the history that I was unaware of. But yes, it's a very rich topic. We really kind of had a procedure that was popularized in the era of essentially medieval medicine. We had not reached, the germ theory of medicine. They did not have the level of understanding that we have today, and we have this procedure it is the most popular surgery. People feel it's the most common surgery done in the United States by far, and that's given it a certain inertia. We have inertia from the doctors who are incentivized to make money by doing it, who are incentivized to not question it too seriously because there are serious ethical questions that could be implied if it was found to be unnecessary, just unnecessary, let alone harmful. And so there's great reluctance to examine it honestly. It's completely understudied within the medical industry in the United States and within the research infrastructure of the United States. It's simply something that's not looked at. We don't keep statistics on what percentage of criminals are circumcised or uncircumcised. We don't keep statistics on how many people who use Viagra are circumcised or uncircumcised, or how many rapists are circumcised or uncircumcised, or anything. It's just taken for granted that everyone is circumcised, and that it just couldn't possibly have any effect on anything whatsoever. And I think that that's actually rather implausible when you think about what's involved. Now, that's not to project what degree of effect that it has. I'm not sure. I can only really speculate, other than the physical changes that take place, which again are very, very difficult to understand secondhand. I was just talking to a friend of mine in the UK today, and he was telling me how he could, and this is a guy who knew I was something of an intactivist, he could not understand what the big deal was. He didn't, he goes, well, I'm happy the way I am. I don't see but it's not, it's just skin. I don't see what's so special about it. And then he was telling me about how he could orgasm by simply taking a little bit of his foreskin and just manipulating it in his fingers like this, like a little pinching, rolling motion, and that this could make him orgasm. And I said, okay, well, guess what? I've never felt that, and I can never feel that. I can't even imagine how that type of stimulation could ever achieve that. And this is just one example, and you could see the lights go off in his head. And he goes, oh, I've never thought. Like, something that he completely took for granted, that's just been part of his sexual life as long as he can remember, and realizing that, well, if you're circumcised at birth, not only have you never had that or experienced that, you never can. And that's and as beneficial in terms of understanding as that conversation is, there's serious limits to it. Like, there's only so much that I can infer about the pleasure that he felt, and there's only so much that he can guess or imagine about, the nature of my sexual existence, based on that. So the other problem here is that conversations like that are very difficult to have. They're certainly taboo. People have a hard time opening up about them. It's one of the reasons, even though I do understand that many of my subscribers are really not particularly interested in this topic and don't want to hear about it, I do find it interesting. And I think it's necessary to have conversations like this for it to move anywhere, right? If we're just going to say that it's awkward or unusual or inappropriate in certain circumstances, so we can't talk about it, then there's no possibility of any kind of movement socially on the topic, and I think that's absolutely warranted. So this is necessary, and interesting. I think it's interesting. So if you I don't know, if you're uncircumcised, go ahead and post in the comments, like, I don't know, some aspect of it that you think that a circumcised person would not understand or could not grasp. And if you are circumcised, why don't you post a question about if you wonder about any aspect of it, to go ahead. But anyway, that's it for now, and I will talk to you all another day. Bye-bye.